Time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all the witnesses for being here. Mick, it's always good to see you, my friend. I'm glad you're here and glad you're doing what you're doing. You know, the premise of this hearing is absurd. I can't believe we're actually having a hearing to talk about doing away with the debt limit. You got to be kidding me. I mean, it's obvious the negative consequences of out of control spending and what they're having. Inflation is at a 40-year high right now. Do we realize that? A 40-year high. And instead of debating whether we should have a debt limit, we ought to be debating the real consequences that spending cuts should have on our debt ceiling. This is ridiculous. Our debt's not going away. Folks, I opened my small business on November 21st, 1988. I borrowed money for inventory. I borrowed money to get me started. I did not get a salary for 2 years, nothing whatsoever. I set out to retire my debt, and I did that. The first thing I did is I retired my debt. Then I retired my mortgage. I haven't owed anybody anything since 1994. This is ridiculous that we have this kind of debt in our country, and it's not sustainable. We've seen it happen over history, over time, what it's done to countries. You know, some people talk about Japan and their enormous debt to GDP ratio. Well, folks, look at Japan's GDP growth rate is abysmal. And similar things are happening right now in Italy. And some of you argue that the interest rates are lower than the growth rate and we can continue to roll over debt, borrowing new money to pay interest on old money. That is simply ridiculous. This is unsustainable. And who's going to be paying this? My children, my grandchildren, your grandchildren. This is intergenerational theft. We have got to stop this. And to debate stopping one of the only things that makes us even think about it has been pointed out here by Mr. Mulvaney and by others. The only time we think about this is when it come up against a debt limit. And Mr. Mulvaney is right. That's the only time we do anything about it. And it does result in good fiscal policy. It does. Mr. Mulvaney, I want to ask you, CBO has noted that rising debt will result in less private investment and lower output and outcome and a lower standard of living for Americans. In fact, their projections show that the long-term impact of debt rising to 200% of GDP, which is where we are headed with this budget, as it brings us to 117%, is a $9,000 annual income loss for Americans. A $9,000 annual income loss. Mr. Mulvaney, are you concerned that the massive growth in debt will crowd out other spending and result in negative economic impacts?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Carter. Thanks, buddy. It's good to see you. I think we're all familiar with the term. Honestly, I think you're seeing some of it now. You're already starting to see, I think one of the many reasons we're experiencing inflation is because the government has become so big. And yeah, I do worry about that in the near term and in the long term. This whole concept that, you know, the debt ceiling is the problem is just befuddling to me. I heard Dr. Shiner mentioned that no good has come of it, but go down the list of all we've done in the past. You know, I mentioned Graham Rudman. I mentioned the 1991 Act, the 2011 Act. Mr. McClintock did the whole list that goes back even further than that. Ask yourself this. What would you have done on fiscal policy if not for the debt ceiling? I mean, show me a couple of pieces of legislation dealing with reducing spending and getting the fiscal house in order that wasn't tied to the debt ceiling. And your point, Mr. Carter, is a good one. I wish my Democrat friends would see it from the same perspective, which is, yeah, it crowds out private sector spending, but it also crowds out other government spending. If you want money to spend on other government programs, it won't be there because it's going to go to pay down the debt. So even if we disagree about how government should spend money, I wish we could agree that we'd rather spend it on doing things than paying off debt in the past. And it worries me that people don't look at that side of it. The interest payments by themselves are getting ready to be the largest single line item in our budget outside of entitlements, and that's a problem.
Just real quick, Mick, I want to ask you one other thing. If we were to reverse our fiscal trajectory and put the federal budget on a sustainable course, what would be some of the positive economic effects?
I think you see less inflation. I think you see more private investment. One of the good things that came from our Tax Cuts Act was we encourage private investment, so you get growth without inflation. You got great growth right now, but you got it with inflation, which is sort of, running on a treadmill. So there's all sorts of benefits that come from spending more money in the private sector and spending less in the government sector.
Great. Thank you so much, and I yield back.